I took the job at Riverside Psychiatric Hospital in September 2004, right after finishing my medical records internship. The facility sat on the outskirts of town, a massive brick building from the 1940s that had seen better days. The pay wasn't great, but I needed the experience, and they were desperate for someone to digitize their old patient records. Most of the building had been renovated over the years, but the basement archives remained frozen in time. Rows upon rows of metal filing cabinets filled with yellowing papers and film reels dating back decades. My workspace was a cramped room in the basement, barely big enough for a desk and computer. The fluorescent lights buzzed constantly, and the ventilation system made strange rattling sounds that echoed through the concrete walls. My job was simple: scan the old files into the digital system and organize them by date and patient ID. Most days I worked alone. The other staff rarely came down here unless they absolutely had to. I started with the most recent files from the 1990s, working my way backward through the decades. The work was monotonous but oddly fascinating. Each folder contained fragments of someone's life: admission forms, treatment notes, medication records, and sometimes photographs. I learned to tune out the unsettling noises from the pipes and focus on the task at hand. That changed when I reached the records from 1985. The first thing I noticed was that these files were different. They weren't standard patient records. They were research files, marked with Project Eclipse in faded red ink. Inside were detailed logs of medical procedures I'd never heard of, with terms like cognitive reconditioning and experimental treatment protocols. The patients' names had been replaced with numbers, but their ages and admission dates were still there. Most were between 18 and 25 years old. As I dug deeper into the files, my hands started shaking. These weren't standard treatments. They were experiments. The logs detailed the use of untested drugs, extreme sleep deprivation, and something called sensory modification therapy. The patients hadn't consented to any of it. According to the records, they'd been admitted for minor issues like anxiety or depression, then transferred to a special ward for advanced treatment. I found a reference to additional records stored in the sub-basement. I didn't even know the building had a sub-basement, but there was a key taped to the back of one file labeled SR Access. After my shift ended and the day staff had gone home, I found the door, a heavy steel thing hidden behind some old shelving units. The key worked, revealing a narrow staircase that led even deeper underground. The sub-basement was a single long room filled with old recording equipment and film reels. The air was thick with dust and the smell of chemicals. I found boxes of unlabeled videotapes and stacks of observation logs. The most recent ones were from 1986, describing breakthrough results in something called memory suppression therapy. My hands trembled as I picked up one of the tapes and noticed a film projector in the corner. It took me a few minutes to thread the film properly. The projector hummed to life, casting a flickering square of light on the wall. The footage showed a small room with white walls. A young woman sat in a chair, electrodes attached to her head. A man in a lab coat injected something into her arm. She started convulsing, but they kept filming. I shut it off, feeling sick to my stomach. There were dozens more tapes just like it. That's when I noticed another door at the far end of the room. This one was solid metal with a small window, like something from a prison. It was locked, but next to it was a maintenance tunnel that seemed to lead to the same area. The tunnel was narrow, with pipes running along the walls. My flashlight beam showed where it curved around and presumably connected to whatever was behind that door. I followed the tunnel until I found a rusted grate in the floor. Through it, I could see into a large room below. It looked like some kind of observation area, with ancient medical equipment still in place. But what made my blood run cold were the restraints. Heavy leather straps attached to examination tables, and what looked like a dentist's chair bolted to the floor. Everything was covered in dust, but otherwise the room looked ready to use. Back in the records room, I found more recent files, transfer papers from the 1990s showing that some of the Project Eclipse patients had been moved to other facilities. But they weren't normal hospitals. They were military research centers, places I'd never heard of. The dates showed that the project hadn't ended in 1986. It had just moved somewhere else. I started noticing things after that. How the night security guard always watched me on the cameras. How Dr. Matthews, the hospital administrator, kept asking about my progress with the old files. The way certain doors in the building required special key cards, even though they were supposedly just storage rooms. I began copying files after hours, taking pictures with my phone when no one was watching. Last week, I was working late when I heard footsteps in the basement hallway. Through the door's window, I saw Dr. Matthews and two men in suits I didn't recognize. They were heading toward the sub-basement. I turned off my lights and hid behind the filing cabinets. Their voices drifted through the walls. Something about resuming trials and suitable candidates. That's when I knew I had to get out. I submitted my resignation the next day, citing family reasons. Dr. Matthews seemed disappointed but didn't argue. As I packed up my desk, I slipped several key files into my bag, proof of what they'd done. The experimental logs, transfer records, everything I could safely take. On my last day, Dr. Matthews called me into his office. He smiled, said they'd been very happy with my work, and handed me a business card. It was for a research facility in Nevada. They're always looking for detail-oriented people, he said. People who understand the importance of discretion. I smiled, thanked him, and left. That was 3 days ago. I'm writing this from a motel room 2 states away. The files are hidden somewhere safe. Tomorrow, I'm meeting with a journalist who specializes in medical ethics investigations. But last night, I saw a black SUV in the parking lot, and the man sitting inside looked familiar. I think he was one of the suits from the basement. I'm checking out early, heading somewhere they won't find me. Because the more I read these files, the more I realize Project Eclipse never really ended. They just got better at hiding it. The Pine Grove State Hospital hired me as a night nurse in June 1973. Back then, psychiatric hospitals were different. Massive, understaffed facilities with hundreds of patients. I worked the overnight shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., when the sprawling building fell into an uneasy quiet. The medication room was my responsibility, a small chamber behind the nurse's station, filled with rows of pills, bottles, and records that had to be meticulously maintained. The first few weeks were routine. I'd distribute evening medications, check on sleeping patients, and handle any emergencies. The day shift nurses barely acknowledged me, especially the head nurse, Margaret Whitaker. She'd been there 20 years and ran the ward like her personal kingdom. Every morning, she'd inspect the medication logs before I left, scrutinizing each entry with her wire-rimmed glasses. Things felt off from the start. Patients who should have been improving weren't. Some seemed over-medicated. Others showed withdrawal symptoms despite their charts showing regular doses. The day shift blamed it on patient non-compliance, but something didn't add up. The medication inventory numbers never matched my counts, yet Margaret's morning inspections always cleared them. I started keeping my own records, comparing medication levels at the start and end of my shifts. The discrepancies were subtle but consistent. Certain medications, mostly sedatives and pain pills, would show mysterious shortages, while others had inexplicable surpluses. The official logs always balanced perfectly by morning, with Margaret's signature at the bottom. One night, I needed extra supplies from the basement storage. The elevator was broken, so I took the back stairs. Before I reached the bottom, I heard voices. Through the crack in the stairwell door, I saw Margaret and Tom Carson, one of the orderlies, sorting through boxes of medications. They were removing pills from hospital bottles and replacing them with something else. A man I'd never seen before was counting out cash on a folding table. I retreated silently up the stairs, my heart pounding. It made sense now. They were selling hospital medications and replacing them with placebos or cheaper substitutes. That's why patients weren't improving, why some were getting worse. The next few nights, I paid closer attention. More staff were involved than I'd thought. The maintenance man who always worked late, the weekend pharmacist, even one of the doctors. I started documenting everything: dates, times, medication discrepancies. I took pictures of the logs with my Polaroid camera and noted which staff members were involved. The hospital's pay was low, but they were making a fortune selling pills on the street. Meanwhile, patients suffered through withdrawal, hallucinations, and relapses. Their real medications replaced with sugar pills or cheap alternatives. Margaret must have noticed something was wrong. Security cameras appeared in new places. My medication room keys disappeared, then mysteriously reappeared in different locations. Night maintenance visits became more frequent. Tom Carson started hanging around after his shift, claiming he was working overtime. I felt their eyes on me constantly. During my break one night, I overheard two orderlies talking in the coffee room. They mentioned a nurse at their previous hospital who'd caused problems and had a nervous breakdown. Had to be committed herself, they said. They looked directly at me as I walked past. The threat was clear. I called the state medical board from the payphone down the street, then the police. They said they'd investigate but needed evidence. I had everything documented in a notebook hidden in my apartment. The next night at work, Margaret called me into her office. She slid a paper across her desk, a patient complaint form, claiming I'd been stealing medications. It was complete fiction, but her message was clear. I quit that night, walked out in the middle of my shift. Margaret watched me leave, that same cold smile on her face, but I'd already mailed copies of my evidence to the medical board, the police, and a local newspaper. 2 days later, I read about a surprise inspection at Pine Grove. Within a week, Margaret, Tom, and 6 others were arrested. The investigation revealed their operation had been running for years. Thousands of dollars worth of medications had been stolen and sold. Patients had died from improper treatment. The hospital administration tried to cover it up, but too many people came forward. Pine Grove closed 6 months later. I drove past the building recently. It's abandoned now, windows boarded up, ivy climbing the walls. But sometimes I think about the patients who suffered there, who couldn't speak up for themselves. Margaret was released from prison last year. I saw her name in the paper. She's working at a nursing home 2 states away. Different name, same position of authority. I've thought about making some calls, but my hands still shake when I pick up the phone. Valley State Psychiatric Center looked exactly like what you'd expect. A massive concrete structure surrounded by chain-link fences topped with razor wire. I'd spent 6 months investigating rumors about patient abuse, building a case that something wasn't right. But filing Freedom of Information requests and interviewing former employees only got me so far. That's why in March 2010, I checked myself in as a patient under a false identity, with a hidden camera embedded in my glasses and a small voice recorder tucked into a hollowed-out paperback book. The intake process was surprisingly easy. I had a solid cover story about hearing voices and experiencing paranoid thoughts. The admitting psychiatrist barely looked at me while filling out forms. Within an hour, I was patient number 2884, wearing pale blue scrubs and paper slippers. They took my belongings except for my book. I'd chosen the bell jar for obvious reasons. My recording devices made it through the cursory search. The first few days revealed the obvious problems: understaffing, outdated facilities, over-medicated patients. But it wasn't until my second week that I noticed the pattern. Certain patients would act out and be taken to the isolation ward. Some never came back to the main floor. The staff explained away their absences with transfers or releases, but the paperwork never seemed to match up. I got my first real lead in the laundry room. Working there was a privilege for well-behaved patients, and I'd earned it by playing along with their treatment plan. While sorting linens, I found paperwork that had been accidentally mixed in. transfer orders with different dates than what was recorded in the main system. Some patients had been logged as released when they were actually moved to the isolation ward. The orderly who supervised laundry duty, Dave, was unusually talkative. He complained about budget cuts and staff shortages while helping me sort sheets. One day, he mentioned how the isolation ward had its own separate record system. Easier to manage difficult cases that way, he said, not meeting my eyes. Some people need extra care, if you know what I mean. The way he said it made my skin crawl. I found the access point to the isolation ward through the maintenance tunnels. There was a network of service corridors underneath the main building, supposedly for repair workers. During recreation time, I managed to slip away and follow them to a heavy security door. Through its small window, I could see another ward, but this one looked nothing like upstairs. The rooms were more like cells. The evidence started piling up. Medication logs showed patients in isolation receiving doses far beyond normal protocols. Staff meetings mentioned specialized treatment programs that weren't documented anywhere official. I recorded everything, slowly building a picture of systematic abuse hidden behind bureaucratic paperwork. 3 weeks in, I had a breakthrough. One night, I overheard 2 security guards talking about cleanup duty in isolation. They mentioned removing evidence before state inspections, laughing about how easy it was to falsify documents. One guard said something about making problems disappear. The other replied, "Yeah, like that girl last month. What was her name, Sarah?" I lay in my bed that night, listening to the sounds of the ward. Through the air vents, I could sometimes hear screaming from the isolation area. The staff dismissed it as episodes, but now I knew better. They weren't just neglecting patients, they were hiding deaths. The isolation ward was where they sent people they knew wouldn't survive their treatment. The pharmacy records proved it. Patients in isolation were being used to test experimental drug combinations. The official logs showed standard medications, but there was a second set of books. I found them in the pharmacy storage room, detailed records of trials conducted without consent or oversight. The death rates were staggering. I was in the administrative office, copying files onto a USB drive, when Dave caught me. He stood in the doorway, keys jangling in his hand. "Figured you weren't really crazy," he said quietly. "Question is, what am I going to do about it?" He stepped into the room and locked the door behind him. I noticed he was wearing latex gloves. What happened next still haunts me. Dave tried to force me toward the isolation ward, saying they had a special room waiting. I fought back, my years of self-defense training finally paying off. In the struggle, he fell down the stairs. I can still hear the sound of his neck breaking on the landing. The security footage would show a patient attacking staff. They'd never suspect I was investigating them. I escaped through the loading dock during shift change. My hidden camera and voice recorder contained enough evidence to shut down Valley State for good. The investigation that followed revealed 47 deaths in the isolation ward over 3 years. They found bodies buried in the woods behind the facility. The hospital administrator and 5 staff members were charged with murder. The trials lasted months. I testified behind a screen to protect my identity, but the nightmares haven't stopped. Sometimes I hear the screams from the air vents, the sound of Dave's neck breaking. The story won me a Pulitzer, but I haven't written anything since. Last week, I got a letter from a former Valley State nurse. She's working at another facility now, and things there seem familiar. She asked if I'd consider going undercover again. I haven't replied yet.